Germany was late to the colonial race. Amidst the heightened rush for the scramble of Africa, the European powers superimposed their imperial vision upon the unexplored continent. Britain and France, and especially Portugal, already had a long presence on the continent, and they had their own plans for it. However, Germany did not, and their own transcontinental vision of Middle Africa became the focus of Germany's own imperial frontier. When Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, Germany inherited a government with explicit aims of imperial conquest. Gone were the days of Bismarck's Eurocentric view of empire. Germany's place in the sun awaited. Leo von Caprivi, Germany's new chancellor, envisaged a new African policy. Though Germany already controlled large swathes of southwest and eastern Africa, it did not have a concrete economic plan for their utility. Historians have argued that the German colonies were adopted on an ad hoc basis. Caprivi's premiership changed this. In 1890, he ceded German interests in Zanzibar to the British for a small strip of land extending from present-day Namibia, known as the Caprivi Strip. This was not a random land grab, but instead a tactical exchange, termed the Anglo-German Agreement. The strip gave Germany access to the Zambezi River, a river which flowed eastwards, and, in theory, would allow commercial exchanges with Eastern Africa. The historian Robert M. Mambo, in his contributions to the Trans-African Journal of History, has argued that the inception of a German colonial vision in Africa was conceived in the diplomatic throes of communication between the British and Germans as they carved out the African continent. In essence, Africa's Germanization was born from the hubris of imperial endeavour and the economic competition it spawned. The Anglo-German Agreement and the associated doctrine of effective occupation, a philosophy which effectively meant first come first served, had allowed Germany to cement its hold on southwest Africa, but, in the view of the historian Roger Louis, left considerable room for misunderstanding in the near future. Land was finite, and both the Germans and British realised it. However, the Germans, being late to the colonial race, opted to usurp the Portuguese Empire, which, at the turn of the 20th century, was in financial ruin. Perhaps by providing a joint Anglo-German loan to the Portuguese, the Germans could leverage the Portuguese colonies for payment. Cape Verde was envisaged to become a German naval base, and Portuguese Angola another source of resources for the German fatherland. In 1898, the German ambassador wrote the following to the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. If a certain eventuality, by no means unwelcome to us, arose, England would adjudicate to uncertain portions of the Portuguese colonies. And, as the Germans commercialised southwest Africa, the Belgian rulers of the Congo and the Portuguese came to grow suspicious of Germany's colonial appetite. Germany had a growing vision for Africa, but with such a vision came challenges. The editor of the German colonial newspaper, Dr. Oskar Karstedt, best summed up the challenge the German Reich had faced after the Great War, when he stated that the colonial possessions that have hitherto belonged to us in Africa had an essentially disconnected, scattered character. A German Middle Africa, reaching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, would, under the physical conditions of the tropics, be invulnerable. A German colonial Reich undoubtedly fitted in with the naval ambitions of the then German Empire. As Dr. Karstedt once again shows, overseas fleets in the future will have no more value than old scrap iron, unless they have the support of points d'appui overseas which would be capable of serving at any moment as munition depots, coaling stations and docks. Think for a moment how more deadly the work of German cruisers might have been if German East Africa on the Indian Ocean or Ludovitz Bay and Douala on the Atlantic had been fully kitted out with naval bases, from which our ships would have had facilities for getting fresh supplies or effective repairs. Such a vision was integral to Germany's development, not as a great power, but as a world power, Germany being dependent upon Britain and the United States for natural resources, a fact which is often forgotten in the historical analogues, needed its own imperial inlet. The German African Empire and its naval squadrons would be able to harass the British fleet. The Suez Canal would not be a safe British waterway, and the primacy of British rule in Asia would gradually be reduced by German Africa's growing imperial prosperity. The plan was to settle the African lands with German migrants, creating a German settler land not dissimilar to Australia. However, the British, having an age-old alliance with the Portuguese, stifled German plans to partition the Portuguese Empire when the British signed the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty in 1899. After all, Anglo-Portuguese relations had diminished when the British prevented Portuguese plans to connect Angola to Mozambique. Britain's own goal of establishing its Cape to Cairo passageway was itself taking shape with the establishment of the Uganda Railway and its victory in the Boer War. The British were winning the colonial race. So, if Africa was already carved up, how could Germany establish its own imperial project in the face of age-old colonial powers? Well, World War I would provide the answer. The Berlin Conference had established that if war was to break out in Europe, then it would be confined to Europe and not spread to the African colonies. Yet when the war did spread to Africa, the opportunity came to seize British and Portuguese colonies by force. Upon occupying Belgium, German imperialists sought to negotiate the attainment of the Congo from their Belgian owners. We can therefore say that the German vision for Africa was evolving in tandem with the events of the European theatre of war. In late 1914, the Germans launched an invasion of Portuguese Angola. German imperialists reckoned that the acquisition of British Rhodesia and Portuguese Angola and Mozambique would provide the pieces required for a greater African Reich. General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck and his East African Askaris kept the colonial fight alive for nearly 4 years, yet dreams of imperial splendour did not manifest in reality. Starved of reinforcements and surrounded by British, French and Portuguese forces, the German territories eventually fell. With this, so too did the dream of Middle Africa. Yet, even in 1918 and 1919, German imperialists still felt that they could pluck something from negotiation at Versailles. And although German demands for the return of their colonies were denied, an ominous forecast was made by the colonialist Emil Zimmermann. Suppose the Anglo-Saxons succeeded in blocking our way to overseas possessions. The result would be that a process would begin in Europe, which would make Middle Europa find its future America in the east of Europe. The implication being that a Germany devoid of African colonies would inhibit migration to the United States and push for living space in Eastern Europe. Thus, as the African ventures of the Second Reich ended, the foundations of the Third Reich were laid.